The latest lockdowns in Sydney and Brisbane have added fuel to a debate that's been raging since the pandemic began. Are lockdowns the best way to deal with outbreaks? A short time ago, I spoke with two medical experts who have very different perspectives. Professor Peter Collignon, who's infectious diseases physician at the Australian National University, and Professor Mike Toole, who's an epidemiologist at the Burnet Institute. Professor Collignon, Professor Toole, thank you both for giving us your time. I'll start with you, Professor Collignon, and go to this question of lockdowns. What's wrong with widespread lockdowns?
Well, lockdowns have got a lot of social and economic impacts, and the really question is when you should do them, weighing up against the costs. Now, my only argument about the Brisbane lockdown, first of all, it was only for 3 days, where the average incubation period is 5 days, and it was done with just one case. And if you think about the people you're trying to lock down, on this case it was all the co-workers of that cleaner, who are mainly essential workers. So unless they were told specifically not to leave home, they would have been travelling anyway. So I'm not actually quite sure what the additional benefit from the lockdown in Brisbane was compared to the standard where you just do contact tracing, testing and keep everybody who's a close contact within, quarantine in their own home for up to 14 days, rather than doing it for the whole city.
Professor Toole, how do you respond to that? The argument, I suppose, has always been that to get hold of it really quickly, there was a need for a short, sharp lockdown. We saw this in Adelaide as well. In your view, is that the way to go?
Yes, I think it is. We've learned a lot since the second wave in Melbourne in June. So I think we should apply those lessons, and I think Queensland did that, or Brisbane, did Adelaide. And I think we need to use every intervention in our toolkit. And of course, testing and tracing is one of those, and it can find people and isolate them. But also there's masks, there's keeping people apart, and a lockdown does that. And of course, hand hygiene and a greater attention to ventilation. So I think we should use all of those, and I think Queensland did it. They've not completely dropped all restrictions, and quite wisely, people will continue to wear masks.
Professor Toole, would Sydney, though, not put a lie to that argument? Sydney has had several other breakouts since the earlier lockdown early in 2020, but it's been dealt with in a case-by-case basis. There have been localised lockdowns. Is that better than a one-size-fits-all, right across the city, hard lockdown?
Well, people have described that as living with the virus, but I think that has quite a heavy social and economic cost. The first cases in Avalon were identified on the 12th of December. So now we are into mid-January, and there's still cases every day. And while the contact tracing system in New South Wales is really excellent, it has its limits. And we saw that today. We saw 3 cases reported yesterday that were not identified by the contact tracers and so have not been isolating, and they're linked to the Barilla cluster. And we saw 2 new cases in Mount Druitt. Mount Druitt is 30 kilometres from Barilla, 70 kilometres from Avalon. So the virus is still all over Greater Sydney.
And Professor Collignon, to that point, it can look a little bit like a whack-a-mole approach, couldn't it? If you're trying to lock it down in Avalon, or in the northern beaches of Sydney, you're trying to lock it down in other parts, you're trying to isolate and trace it, and it keeps popping up in other parts of the city. Wouldn't that be an argument for what we have seen in Adelaide and what we have seen in Brisbane?
Well, I think Adelaide, it made no difference having their lockdown. All their cases were found by contact tracers. There were no unknown cases that were affected by the lockdown. So I think Adelaide is an example where it didn't actually benefit. If you look at Australia, the only disaster we've had where this approach hasn't worked was the Melbourne winter disaster. But there were a lot of factors involved with that, including, inappropriate training, inappropriate supervision, etc., which we don't think will be repeated. It's also summer, not winter. And the reality is that if you'd put Sydney into a lockdown in, say, the 10th of December, they'd still be in it, and they'll be in it for another few weeks. Now, that's a huge price for 5 million people to pay if it looks like these clusters can be brought under control anyway. There was a localised lockdown in the Avalon area that seems to be successful because there were lots of people there with infections and some weren't obviously linked in the first place. Now, the reality is people say, oh, look, New South Wales isn't trying to eliminate the virus. That may be true, but they have eliminated. These 2 clusters that are happening now are new viruses that have come in more recently.
And I just want to go to that, Professor Collignon, in the short time that we have left, a response from you and then a response from Professor Toole. with this new strain, which we've already seen just ripping through the UK, and we know is so much more transmissible, so much more contagious. Are you concerned here with this, that we may need to see more stringent, more hardline approaches to dealing with it?
Well, we may need to see more restrictions on how many people inside, yes. But so far in Brisbane, it hasn't shown that it's, greatly different to the other viruses. So we need to be careful. We're going to have to live with this for another year or even 2 years with the restrictions. So we need to do what's sustainable, consistent, predictable. Otherwise, we'll have problems with people, complying, I think.
Professor Toole, the new strain, what are your concerns and how should this be approached?
Well, I think it increased the risk of further transmission. But it doesn't change the precautions that we should take. And just to go back to whether we could have implemented a broader lockdown in Greater Sydney back in mid-December, there's no reason to believe that that lockdown would still be in place, because it could have, and probably would have, prevented spread to Erskineville, the CBD, Paddington, Croydon, Berrilla and now Mount Druitt. So it could have been contained earlier, particularly if masks had been mandated earlier.
Yeah, a great discussion. Good to talk to you both. Thank you again for giving us your time.
Thank you, Stan.
Hi, I'm Lee Sales. Thanks for watching this story. If you'd like to watch more of 7:30's stories, they are on the left of your screen. And tap on the button below to subscribe and get the latest from ABC News.